These are the Benin bronzes. Looted from Africa in the 19th century, they are now recognized as one of the continent's greatest artistic masterpieces. Made as commemorative plaques, they were created to decorate the royal palaces of the ancient kingdom of Benin. They also tell the stories of Benin's first encounters with other civilizations. Today, Benin City is now part of Nigeria, a land ruled for 1,000 years by tribal kings called the Oba. Benin is still ruled by an Oba, and many of their royal bronzes have been preserved. Iwure II is the 39th ruler in a line that stretches back to the 12th century. It was under the Oba's patronage that bronze casters created their works of art, passing down their skills from generation to generation, right up to the present-day masters.
Bronze casting industry is recognized by the palace. I was born and brought up into the family of bronze casters in Benin. My father transferred his experience to me. It's hereditary. Very many of our children are going into bronze casting too. So it's a continuous exercise.
Benin's bronze casters used techniques they had inherited from other West African peoples that dated back to the 10th century. These heads, created by the Ife people, depict now forgotten kings and queens.
The bronze casters of Benin were not just great artists, they were also, in a sense, historians, because it was their art, their statues and their plaques that recorded the great events in Benin civilization, which included, in the 15th century, the arrival of the first Europeans.
We need to remember that in many settings, Europe was a bit player. They didn't have a technological advantage always. They suffered in the climate. They were tiny groups of people going to vast realms.
For centuries, Benin's bronze casters had acquired their raw materials from Muslim merchants coming across the Sahara. But the arrival of Portuguese traders created a boom in bronze making that would enrich both societies. At first, the Portuguese sought commerce, not conquest. Their merchants, missionaries, and mercenaries, like this one, came to Benin, and the Oba sent his representatives to Lisbon. On the Oba's palace walls, brass panels showed Portuguese faces, with their caricature long noses and beards. But perhaps one of the greatest and most mysterious of Benin treasures is this. Exquisitely carved from ivory, this elegant naturalistic face projects authority, as befits the 16th century Queen Mother it is believed to represent. Called Idia, almost hidden in her crown, is an important clue to how the Benin regarded their new trading partners. A row of tiny bearded faces. Are they the bearded water god of the Benin called Ido? Or are they Portuguese sailors? Perhaps Idia's headdress was an attempt to incorporate Europeans into the evolving Benin worldview.
Trade with the Portuguese meant that the Kingdom of Benin, like a number of African societies, was drawn into a new Atlantic world.
African traders loaded locally produced goods onto European ships that sailed up African rivers. They traded in cloth and in pepper, in gold and ivory, and also in slaves, though at this point in very small numbers. But Africans also exported the work of African artists who found new customers in Europe.
The figures on this ivory salt cellar wear European clothes and Christian crosses. The lid is crowned with a tiny Portuguese sailing ship topped with a crow's nest. On a musical horn made from an ivory tusk, here is engraved the coat of arms of Portuguese royalty, the House of Aviz. All these treasures were destined for Portugal's great port city, Lisbon. And with these beautiful works of art come thousands of new arrivals. A reality that was captured in an extraordinary painting, the King's Fountain.
This is Lisbon in the 16th century, at the very height of Portugal's global trading empire. It's a part of the city called the King's Fountain. The fountain is shown here, but what's obvious, what's striking about this picture is the people. Lisbon, in this painting, looks more like a 21st century capital, because as Portugal's trading empire expanded around the world, people from across that empire came to Lisbon. And incredibly, it's believed that 1 in 10 of Lisbon's population were Africans. The Africans in this painting are existing at every level of the social strata. There's a criminal who's been arrested here. There are the boatmen who are ferrying people across the river. There are the aguadeiros. These are water carriers. They are almost certainly slaves, carrying water on their heads back to the homes of their masters. But there were white slaves as well as black slaves in Lisbon in the 16th century. But there's also figures like this. This is a black knight, a man of the Order of Santiago, on his horse with his sword and his cloak and all his finery. And it's a snapshot of a world that we've forgotten about. Lisbon at the center of the first age of globalization.
This is the fortified tower of Belém, built to protect Lisbon Harbor. Under its watchful gaze, Portugal's navigators set out to map the globe. And at the same time, create one of the world's first global trade networks. On one corner of the tower is a celebrated icon of Portuguese global reach. It's a rhinoceros, a real animal sent to the King of Portugal by an Indian prince. It was later immortalized by the German artist Albrecht Dürer, based only on a written description. But despite its inaccuracies, thanks to the emerging technology of printing, Dürer's image would become the definitive picture of what Europeans thought a rhino looked like for the next 200 years. In Japan, European merchants encountered a feudal society too robust to be conquered.
Although the details are vague, it's believed that the very first Europeans to reach Japan arrived by accident. They were a group of Portuguese merchants on board a Chinese ship that was driven ashore by a storm around the year 1543. The Japanese were fascinated by these new arrivals, who they regarded as little more than exotic novelties. But within just a few years, the Portuguese began to arrive in these waters in their own ships. And from the very beginning, it was obvious to them that the Japanese were not a people who they could treat the way the Spanish had treated the Aztecs. Japan was extremely wealthy. She had an enormous population, a highly sophisticated culture, and militarily, she was a formidable power. This was not a country in which Europeans could even dream of being conquistadors. So the Portuguese instead became Japan's trading partners.
Portuguese traders brought new goods and new technologies from every corner of their trading empire. Though Japan believed firmly in the superiority of its own ancient culture, to begin with, it opened its doors to European merchants. And the arrival of exotic strangers helped spawn a whole new Japanese art form, Namban screens.
Namban was the Japanese word for Europeans, and what it means, rather unflatteringly, is southern barbarians, because the Japanese were not at all impressed by European standards of hygiene or European table manners. What these screens tend to show are the great black ocean-going ships of the Portuguese Empire, loaded with exotic trading goods. Now, most of these goods weren't from Lisbon, they weren't European goods, they were goods from other parts of the Portuguese trading empire. At the heart of the trade was silk from China. Now, the Japanese artists who produced these screens were very careful to pick out the most exotic and the most valuable products. Exotic animals that were either rare or unknown to the Japanese being brought ashore in cages. But there's also a horse, an Arabian war horse, an extremely desirable object in a militarized society like feudal Japan. But just as exotic and just as exciting as any of these goods are the people coming off these Portuguese ships. Africans, both free and enslaved, but there's also Indians, there's Malays, there's Arabs.
From this glittering parade is apparent not just the fascination the Japanese must have felt when this global circus first arrived, but wariness. The screens also depict a more controversial arrival: Catholic missionaries. The stability of Japan was threatened by competing foreign influences bent on change. In defense of traditional Japanese values, a new regime arose: the shogunate. The shogun knew of the destruction of the Aztec and Inca empires and was determined the same fate would not befall Japan, so he decided to act.
Almost all foreigners, not just the missionaries, were rejected. And Japanese people themselves were prevented from traveling abroad. The shoguns then promoted a sort of Japanese cultural renaissance, one that looked not outwards to other civilizations, but inwards to Japan's own cultural traditions. And they used Japan's artistic traditions as a way of tightening their grip on power and creating a new sense of what it meant to be Japanese.